we have sound? Yeah, okay, good. So hi everybody. We hear so often that we should be focused and we should say no to things and all of that, but it's not very easy to do in practice because everything that comes along sounds like a good idea at the time, right? And the reason that I called this talk Position, 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 it's kind of a reference to real estate. You know, they say the three most important things in real estate are location, location, and location. And it's the sense of sort of where are we, where do we stand so that we can actually make the right decisions. And particularly, if we don't know where we stand, how are we going to know, if we're supposed to say no to everything, how are we going to know when to say yes, right? And when will we know how to say no? So it's pretty fundamental. And I want to kind of tell you how we think about this at Basecamp and how we've used this to, I think, survive for like 15 years now doing this. So actually, I'm going to tell you, in order to sort of establish some language, I want to give you a way, like a tool for how you can think about this, the way that we think about it. And I'm going to use a kind of classic example. So this is the story that I learned from a mentor of mine named Bob Mesta. And it's the story of the work that he did with the team of Snickers in the 90s. And it's basically Snickers had the idea that they were competing with Milky Way at the time, even though they're both made by the same company, and even both bars were made on the same line. They decided that they needed to compete for this particular spot at the retailer. And so they're both candy bars. They were both marketing themselves as delicious chocolate candy bar, okay? And they said, we need to get a new point of view on this. So they did something different. The folks at Snickers, and Bob was working with them, they went and they looked at the situation people were in when they bought the Snickers bar, okay? And they saw an interesting pattern. So everybody who bought a Snickers was in public, and they were kind of on the go, and they had missed a meal, and they were starting to get hungry, but they couldn't stop what they were doing, okay? So it would be like somebody who's on their way, misses lunch, then has a meeting, and they're on the way to the meeting, and they start to realize, like, oh, my stomach is growling, and I'm starting to get a little bit tired, I'm going to be grumpy, right? And then they buy the Snickers bar, and then they're on the train on the way to the meeting, and then they unwrap it, and hop, 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 3 bites, and it's gone, and they're like satisfied, and they're back, okay? This is the Snickers story. And they started asking people, they said, well, when you were in the same situation, did you ever use anything other than a Snickers bar to get through that moment? And they said, yeah, sometimes I would use an energy bar, or I'd eat an apple, or maybe a Coke would do it. It would kind of lift my energy up, temporarily. So you start to see a surprising competitive set of non-candy bar competitors that appear in this situation, right? So then they did the exact same thing for Milky Way. And they talked to the people who ate the Milky Ways, and it turns out that all of them had had an emotional event. Okay, so they had like a very difficult conversation, or they had a bad meeting, or you know what I mean, this kind of a thing. And they didn't eat it in private. They didn't eat it in public. They ate it in private. So they would go buy it and put it in their purse, or they would go home and they would find they have like the secret chocolate hidden area, and they would get the chocolate, and then they would be alone, and then they would have their chocolate, right? And they would have like this recovery, okay? So very, very different circumstance, right? And what did this sort of compete with? Well, it could have been a glass of red wine, it could have been ice cream, it could have been like a chocolate truffle, right? So again, very different competitive set, right? So this, what is this market, right? It's not the candy bar market. Yeah, it's what is this? This is a very different way of framing competition. So I want to give you some terms you can use to think about this. So the sort of traditional way that we talk about things is what we could call from the supply side. So this is using the product category, whether it's our category or something that's been existing for a long time. We start to think this is a candy bar, and this is what a candy bar should be, and it's chocolate and it's tasty, and then did we make a good one or not, right? And who are our competitors, other candy bars, right? So this is the traditional way of thinking. But what we described is is very different. So the way that we got to this kind of unusual competitive set was by taking the product out completely. This is impossible to get founders to do, but it's very important. You have to completely take your product out of the picture and say, what was the living human circumstance that my product fits into, right? So we're kind of defining the space instead of the thing, right? And so this cartoon sort of illustrates the fact that there's a sequence of events that happens in somebody's life, and they're not random. It's happening through cause and effect. It's a chain of cause and effect that leads them up to a moment where they're in a situation and they're struggling. They're like, how am I going to solve this? I'm out of time, I'm hungry, I'm going to do bad at the meet. Like, I need something. Or, I had such a day, like, what am I going to do about this, right? So this is the struggling moment. And they need to figure out, they have some idea of the state they want to be in, but they have to make choices and figure out what their options are to get there. And that's when they shop, and that's when they start comparing, and that's when maybe your product becomes relevant. But when it does, it's in this surprising competitive set, because these are all the things that do the job in that circumstance. So this is a very different way of thinking. So the first thing we can do if we want to try and talk about kind of what is a position is we can ask the question of, what game do I want to be in, first of all? Right? So what is it that I'm actually trying to be good at? And in this case, Snickers actually, they started to change their marketing. This was in the 90s when this happened. And this is when they first changed to this whole you're not you when you're hungry campaign, right? And which makes sense. And then Milky Way went with something like get lost in the Milky Way, right? Like looking inward and taking time, and it was very, very good. And what's interesting is that this isn't just some arbitrary choice of like whatever, you know. These are different businesses. So if you think about this competitive set, the notion of like chocolate to make you feel better is not exactly an innovative idea. Right? I mean, it's like you could say it's a crowded market, right? But the notion of a chocolate bar to get you through a moment where you're low on energy, that's more like food. This sort of quick boost of energy, this was new at the time. And if you look at Snickers numbers, you'll see that story. I mean, the growth is unbelievable once they figured this out, right? And they remain one of the top candy bars because they kind of fit this unique circumstance. So the first thing is like, where are we in terms of are we solving this situation or that situation? That's a position thing. The second thing is, what are the product attributes that we have to get right? So now this is important. If we want to locate something in real estate, then we can use like latitude and longitude, right? And then we can use 2 points and find it. Or if we want to locate something in space, we can say X, Y, Z, and then here's the point. But what are the dimensions that we use to judge whether the product is in the right location or not? And here's where so many, especially like our tech world, everybody is using the same stupid words. It's easy, it's simple, it's clean, right? What the fuck do these things mean? Like, it doesn't, like, you know what I mean? Like, they mean nothing. And then you compare competitors, and they're all saying the same thing, right? So this is like the candy bar saying, we are tasty chocolate, right? Means nothing, right? So what are the attributes that actually make a difference to which situation you're solving? So if you're on the go, and you're hungry, and you have no time, and you have to keep going, it has to be instant, right? You don't have time to sit there and like eat an ice cream, right? It doesn't work. But at the same time, if you've had the bad day and you're trying to have recovery, if it's instant, that's a bad thing, right? Because it's over too fast. Yeah? So how long does it take to chew caramel, right? Versus biting an apple and swallowing, right? These are product attributes that affect the fitness. Can I eat it in public or private? So is it going to melt? What can I store it in? Right? What's the social convention? Like, it'd be a little bit odd to have a glass of wine on the train or something, right? You know, but this is a major factor, right? And of course, is it going to boost my energy or is it going to relax me? So if somebody had the bright idea to start putting caffeine in the Milky Way, it wouldn't necessarily make any sense, but caffeine in the Snickers bar would be like, oh, actually, that does make sense, right? So you start to see it like this. So this is in terms of product attributes. So I want to connect this to software. So we made the first version of Basecamp in 2004. And before that, we were a web design shop. So we were doing website redesigns. And we had a problem. So this is like a lot of, it's like startups that work out. Like you had a real problem that you solved. So we had this thing where we were communicating with the client, and somebody would send the client the work. The client would respond, but then that was a different person than the designer, so they would send the email on to the designer. The designer would do the work and then give it to somebody else and give it to the client, and stuff would get lost and stuff would take too long, and it broke down sometimes. So this was in the early 2000s when blogs were new. It was like a blog, wow. It was like a new thing. And so Jason had this idea, like, well, what if we had a password-protected blog where we would post the work for the client to see, and the client would review it and put their comments there, and everybody who was involved in the project would see the same stuff, and then we'd be on the same page, and nothing would get dropped, it'd be easy, blah, 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 right? So, boom, okay, so that's like the seed of Basecamp. And when we first released Basecamp in 2004, we were explaining it like this. We were saying that it's a client extranet. So this was a client extranet for creative services firms, extremely specific, right? Really narrow. And then we also started to think about it a bit like project management, because we noticed we were putting the status of the project there, and we were putting the schedule there of like what the what the phases of the project. So it started to feel like project management, even though it was very different from traditional project management. So this is how we were pitching it at the time. And this worked out really well. It started growing like crazy, and it went very, very well. And people used it exactly the way that we intended. So we had a lot of creative services firms who were using it with their clients as an extranet. Boom, great. But then as time went on, the whole Web 2.0 wave happened, and we started to see all these other tools out there, and they were all saying the same thing. We're doing team communication and group productivity and project management, and it was all remote and web-based and online, blah, blah, blah. And also at the same time, we started to have some confusion on the demand side, because we talked to our customers. So now we're in maybe 2012, 2011, 2012, when we did our first big redesign of the product. We would talk to our customers, and they would say, oh, we don't work with clients. And we'd talk to other customers, and they'd be like, yeah, we're not a creative service firm. we had like accountants, lawyers, churches, government people, like all kinds of people were using Basecamp. So our understanding from the demand side wasn't helping us to kind of know what the heck this thing was anymore. And then at the same time, there was this sort of new kind of confusion on the supply side of all this stuff supposedly, right? And you have stuff like Dropbox, and it's like, well, Basecamp does file sharing, but Dropbox integrates down into the OS, and you can just drag it into a folder and everybody gets it. Like, should we be doing that, right? Or Google has instant live editing, and we have documents, right? So should we be doing that, right? But we knew that these were all just candy bars, right? So we have no sense, just by looking at the supply side, looking at the product category or how people sell things, if we're actually competitors or not, right? And if any of these things matter for us. So what do we do to sort of get clarity? We went through the same exercise. So actually we worked with Bob, who I mentioned, Bob Mesta, who the Snickers story comes from, and he taught us how to do these customer interviews. And actually these interviews, they're more like interrogations, because if you ask somebody why they bought, you can't do that, because they give you a rationalization, right? They tell you a story. But what we don't want a rationalization. Actually, we don't really want to know why they bought necessarily. We want to know what happened. So it's a bit more like the scene of the crime, Yeah? So we only speak to people who bought, and then we dig backwards to get to this chain of cause and effect of what happened to you, why did you need to buy something, what were your options, why then? Right? People will say, oh, I bought it because it had more features than the other one. Okay, but why on a Tuesday at 3 p.m. were you looking at a list of features? Right? Right? So we get into this situation. So this is what we learned, actually. So, by the way, we saw about maybe 3 main kind of stories, but in the interest of time, I can tell you this one. This is sort of the dominant one that we can use. So there were small businesses, and quite small, and or maybe an occasion you'd have like a small team in a bigger business, but mainly small businesses. And this is the owner or the main manager who's having this issue. And they are using email and spreadsheets and meetings, just ad hoc, whatever they can to keep track of what's going on with the work. And actually, this is totally fine. Everybody who starts off on some project with a small team, you can get by with email and your own weird spreadsheet for a while. But then what happens is they started to grow. And as they started to grow, there was a higher volume of emails. There was kind of more work in play at a given moment, so maybe they hired 1 or 2 more people, or they brought on a couple more clients than they had had before. And then all of a sudden, they found out that they couldn't manage everything the way that they used to. It was just like things were getting lost, things were getting dropped, and they started to have this feeling of like, I can't keep track of stuff anymore. Like, we're going to break. We're gonna miss something that the client needs. I'm gonna forget something. Something's gonna be late. Like, we're gonna screw up, and this is gonna be bad for us. So they're in this situation where they realize, like, I need to do something so I can know what's going on. How am I gonna do this? Right? It's like we need to know what's going on around here. So that's where Basecamp fits in. And once we understood this really helped us to sort of clarify and articulate kind of our choices in terms of product attributes, what to build and what not to build. Oh, yeah, before that. So this is the marketing site that we ended up doing. And it doesn't say project management. It doesn't say client extranet. It just has a big picture of a lady with her hair on fire because she's having such a hard time managing everything. And it says, all growing businesses run into the same problems. Hair on fire, buried under email, stuff everywhere. Everything's going to be organized in one place. You're going to know exactly what's going on, and people are going to be on the same page. Right? So we're describing the situation, and we're explaining how it's going to be better, and we're not putting ourselves into some category and saying, Basecamp's #1 project management, or something like that. And by the way, when we did this, we tripled our prices, and it went very well for us. So now we can look kind of competitively, quote unquote, because these aren't really our competitors. But we can look at what else is out there and understand how we fit in better. If we look at things in terms of the product categories, then you think, well, there's a to-do list app out there that's big, so that's taken. And there's a chat app out there that's big, and that's taken. And there's this and that. And the world starts to feel small. But when you shift from the supply side to the demand side and you look at the space of circumstances and unsolved problems, it starts to feel really, really big and open, And so kind of in terms of the situation, we've got us here and each of these tools has their own situations that they're solving. And this is sort of a helpful way to think about this is in terms of more about, less about. What are we more about and what are we less about? These are the trade-offs we're making. So there's, for example, high-end project management tools like Asana that have a lot of task tracking, and these offer a lot of additional controls. So there's a lot of permission controls. There's every administrative setting you would need. The tasks have all the different kinds of metadata that you might need for tracking tasks. And then people come to us sometimes and they say, hey, would you consider adding, more permissions or adding more of this and adding more of that? And we say no. And the reason is that we're not really about all these additional controls. What we're really about is having fewer options, Because what we've understood is that in the small business context where we're needed in that circumstance that I drew out, actually the owner is using it side by side with their employees. And they don't want to coerce people and twist their arm and tell them to use something that they know sucks, right? Asana doesn't suck. What I mean is that they don't want to use something that is difficult or is unnatural or causes them extra stress or something like that. So the bottom-up adoption is extremely important in this circumstance, not in general. It doesn't matter at all if you're in a more corporate setting, right? But in this situation, the bottom-up adoption is essential. So we actually hear from customers in these interviews who say, yeah, and then I looked at Asana, but I said, my people aren't going to use that. And they kept looking, right? And if we start to add more features, what's going to happen is we can make these customers happy. Maybe they'll even say, hey, we'll pay you double if you add this extra permission layer, right? We could go up market. But if we do that, we're going to give up this, and we're not going to fit in this position anymore, right? Slack has taken off. Everybody uses it. It's doing very, very well. And we started hearing a lot of questions about, do you guys compete with Slack? What's going on, right? So Slack is very, very good for increased communication. It gives you this kind of new lateral connection across the company that wasn't there before. It's fantastic for that. But the thing is that this is what it does. It gives you more communication. And the thing is that the people who were in the situation that I described, they have too much already. Right? They already had too much in the email. They already had a mess of text messages. And the thing is that Slack is unstructured communication. The fact that it's in a channel isn't enough. It's not structured information. So if you want to find something, you can't really. And if you want to know something, you have to monitor it all day. Right? So this is not solving the problem. So we actually want, what we're trying to give people is less communication, even though we're like a communication tool. Right? So, for example, somebody puts a to-do in Basecamp, and then they don't even have to speak to anybody. They get a notification, this is assigned to you. When they check it off, the person who assigned it gets a notification that says this is done. If they want to know if it's done or not, they know where to go to look at it. No communication necessary, right? Totally different world, right? So we're not competing there. We're doing the opposite. And then, like things like Google Drive and Dropbox, you can collaborate on the source files. We have a lot of creative still. But in Basecamp, it's about publishing and review. So it's more about the flat file, and I want to. This is ready to show. I'm going to post it there, and then somebody's going to look at it and post a comment back. Our customers aren't trying to solve the problem of how do we both edit the same Photoshop file or how do we edit the same document. Okay, so that's just that's sort of a look at that. And so what happens is the questions will come up. So for example, since the beginning, people have been asking us to build Gantt charts into Basecamp or dependency tracking, right? And we've been saying no, no, no for forever. And the reason is because of this, right? We don't want to give more control because what's going to happen is it's going to make it look scarier and less intuitive for people who are trying to do this bottom-up adoption. And then other things come up like recurring events. We have a lot of requests for that right now. And we can look at where we stand and what we're doing and what we're not doing, and we can say, oh, this totally fits, right? They're actually trying to have a structure where everything is in one place, and they need to sort of communicate less and have less back and forth, and if they could just put this in Basecamp, it'd be done. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it. So this is what I want to leave you with. This is sort of a summary picture of these concepts. The supply point of view is what we're using all the time. So every time a customer says, can you please do X, they're talking supply side, right? Because they're talking about what to build. The supply side is what's built, right? Anytime somebody has a meeting, comes to a meeting and they say, hey, we think that we should build X, that's supply side thinking. There's no inherent value from the supply side, right? And there's no sense of a position, so it leads to misleading comparisons. So what we want to do is we want to always, in every one of these cases, switch over to the demand side, and we want to say, tell me a real story of a real chain of cause and effect that happened to a real person so I can understand when and how this was needed. Because then we have actual requirements, right? So it's the situation through time where the product is undefined, where there's no product there, that explains what matters. And this is what defines the real competitive set. And then if we have a demand-side understanding of what's going on, then we can plug different supply ideas into that. And we can say, where does this position us? Which situation are we solving? And what's our fitness, right? How well, if we put this into that, if we put this supply into this spot, how well does it fit, right? Do we do the job well or not? So that's what I wanted to tell you about for this morning. And I'll be giving another talk in the afternoon. And the notion there is that if what we build is so important, right? Because it's not just an automatic given that we're in a category, so we check off every box of the category, then our ability to actually ship the stuff that we want to build is important, right? And we have a very good track record over the years of shipping what we actually intend to ship instead of being lost in endless development cycles. So that'll be this afternoon. So I just want to refer to Bob Mesta. He's the one that I learned this sort of demand side thinking from. And this is the signal versus noise post that covers some of the same ground. Demandthinking.com, you can see 2 videos there where we go through very, very detailed case studies of how we've applied this for Basecamp features. And you can find me on Twitter there. So that's what I had for you this morning. It looks like we have a few minutes for questions here. What question consistently produces the most helpful insights when interviewing customers? So interviewing isn't a question. If I had to answer, I would say, so we see that you bought 3 weeks ago. What was going on? That would be the best question, okay? But the interviewing isn't about questions. It's not a survey. It's about the interrogation of what caused it. So why then? Why not earlier? Why not later? What was going on at that time? And we can talk about interviewing, in the breaks and stuff like that. Are your customers always open to share their problem and answer your questions? They love it. It's like a therapy session. It's like you're like, so what was going on? And they're like, we were dying, we were having this thing, and then this blew up, and then the client. So I mean, of course, you have to establish a certain rapport. You have to have a certain way with how you kind of lead into the interview. But with a bit of practice, it's fantastic. They open up very well. Because it's not often people are actually really interested in what happens in your life. You know what I mean? Like, we're genuinely interested in what happened to them, and we're not trying to sell them anything because of the fact that there's that gap, right? That we're not trying to talk about our solution. Let's see. Do you have to choose between situational scenarios, or could you solve them all? Yeah, so I can't speak to that in general. In general, yes, but I can't really say. We'd have to talk for a while. Right? What we found is that the things that we're doing right happen to work in all the cases. But we've also noticed that some of them are bigger markets than others, and some of them are more profitable markets than others. So we can take the different situations we do and say, is there a conflict in terms of product attributes? If yes, then we're going to cut out something that we don't want to be and focus on the other one. And then to the extent that there isn't a conflict in product attributes, then we say, fine, that's not going to affect us in terms of product development, but then how do we see lifetime value differently for this situation versus that, or our ability to market or something like that. So there's dimensions on that side. Which channels do you use to approach your customers? So we just go through word of mouth. And the way that Basecamp works facilitates that. And because people invite other people to use it, so there's a natural spreading there. How do you figure out your position if you do not yet have enough customers to ask? So this is the notion that Bob talks about, that if you look him up, you can see him talking about this, that there's no new consumption. Whoever might buy your thing is doing something already. It might be a workaround. It might be something, look at how weird that competitive set was, right? It's like, well, nobody's eaten a chocolate candy bar before for a quick, energy boost. Well, they were eating the apple, right? So if we can think about, if we can figure out the situation that our product serves, then we can start to think about, like, well, how are they getting the job done today without it? And then you can see how what you're going to offer is an improvement. That's a way to think about that. And that's time. Right, yep.